Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we will quietly crack open the heavy, sculpted doors of Versailles to look straight into the moment a self-proclaimed god decays on the very bed once draped in fragrant silk. Imagine this: Louis XIV, the Sun King, who once stepped before his court in a robe of gold, now shivering with relentless fever, his breath reeking of something foul and metallic. His left leg has darkened like rotting wood, the skin splitting open, pus seeping onto the linen sheets, his attendants some bowing in prayer, others pretending not to notice, not admit that absolute power itself is decomposing day by day. If you're looking for a soothing bedtime story, fair warning, you might not make it to the end tonight as we dive into the final gruesome details of the battle between pride and rotting flesh. Before you lie back and relax, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly enjoy what I share here. And if you're watching, don't hesitate to comment and let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I'd love to know who's wandering these death-scented corridors with me tonight. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan to hear the gentle hum of wind. And let's step into tonight's journey together. We are now inside the royal bedchamber, where every wall is draped with enormous hand-woven tapestries, once perfumed to mask the damp smell of Versailles' stone walls. But tonight, no drop of essential oil can hide the horrific scent seeping through every crevice, the smell of rotting flesh, of power slipping away from the marrow of a man. Louis XIV lies flat on the enormous bed carved with cherubs. His eyes, once fierce and blazing, are now veiled in a dull haze. From time to time, his half-closed lids flutter with sudden jolts of pain. His left leggings supporting his towering royal figure is now swollen, the skin stretched taut and black as coal. A mere touch could cause it to split open, revealing bruised red flesh, radiating heat and an odor so foul it drives servants to turn away and vomit. It is said that for weeks, Louis insisted on maintaining the morning rituals. At dawn, courtiers were summoned to witness the king's awakening, but instead of the usual majestic scene, they saw only a trembling old man, gasping for breath, struggling to keep his voice from cracking. The tragedy wasn't just physical decay, it was the haunting need to maintain the performance of power until the bitter end. During audiences, Louis was propped up with silk cushions, his hands resting on thick blankets. Whenever pain surged up his leg, he clenched the mattress edge. Knuckle pale, the king who once ordered the slaughter of tens of thousands to expand his realm could now only groan, "May God forgive me. Please end this pain." His personal physician, Fagon, had no options left but to cut, lance, and apply acupuncture daily. Each morning, bandages fused to open wounds were peeled away like raw skin. Then salt, vinegar, and ash were sprinkled over the necrotic tissue in desperate attempts at sterilization. But nothing worked. The wound spread from his ankle to his groin, gradually turning the leg into a decaying column of flesh beyond healing. Even the most hardened servants couldn't last long in the sealed room. Historians wrote that each time the bed curtains were pulled back to change dressings, the stench rushed into the hallway like a wave. Some tried to stand still in courtly discipline, then bent over, gagged, and ran out retching. Dukes and counts masked their noses with handkerchiefs, pretending to cough, unable to admit they were more terrified than sympathetic. But Louis himself was the one most cruelly imprisoned in that hell. He couldn't leave the bed, couldn't turn his body, couldn't recognize many familiar faces. At times, he murmured the names of people who had died decades earlier: his mother, his wife, generals who once fought by his side.
He had some dizzy spells, but he wasn't more concerned than that. On the 10th of August, he felt a pain in his left leg.
Muttering fragments of funeral prayers in a hoarse whisper. One night, the pain became unbearable. Louis gripped his doctor's arm, pleading in a choked voice, "Cut off this leg, I beg you. Even if I die instantly, I'll accept it." But they dared not. The gangrene had reached the bone. Surgery now would mean immediate death. All they could do was increase the dose of opium to ease his spasms and wait for the body to complete its final task: decay. As time passed, the room became an open-air tomb. Each night, the attendants took turns keeping watch, for none had the courage to stay too long. Louis drifted in and out of delirium for hours, waking with eyes wide, calling for someone he couldn't remember. Even his breath felt heavy as damp smoke, dissolving into yellowed curtains stained by sweat and disinfectant.
In 1638, so the fact that the doctor and patient had the same age must have created a type of bond, complicity maybe, complementarity even. The king confided in him. He had the king's trust, and Fagon was extremely well respected at the court.
In a rare moment of clarity, Louis stared at the dying candles on the silver stand and seemed to understand better than anyone. None of the rituals, silks, or thrones could save him from nature's brutal decree. Power had lifted him to the heights, and now it chained him to this bed of death, where he was no longer the Sunday king, but merely a rotting body waiting for an end. The next morning, the doors were opened to receive visiting dignitaries, but few dared step more than 3 paces in. Repelled by the suffocating wall of odor, those who ventured closer were overwhelmed. Some collapsed on the floor, unconscious. Others fell to their knees, trembling, unsure whether to pray for the king or beg to be released from that place. In his final days, Louis was nearly unconscious. He lay in a stupor all afternoon, lips mumbling meaningless apologies. When he awoke, he could barely whisper to his 5-year-old great-grandson boy soon to inherit the throne, "Don't repeat my mistakes, be a kinder king." And then, night fell. Amid the soft crackle of candles and the spreading stench of death throughout the palace, he gently closed his eyes and exhaled one last time. There was no grand music for farewell, only the faint moans of a few servants brave enough to remain, and a silence as heavy as the burial shroud wrapped around his corpse. There has been much debate over the cruel illness that imprisoned Louis XIV in a bed reeking of death through the final years of his life. And if you quietly observe that picture, you'll see that this was not just an ordinary wound, but the result of decades of extravagant habits and misguided medical beliefs. Historians agree that the root of this tragedy likely began as a small ulcer on his left shin, perhaps a scrape or a bruise from an impact, but it never healed. In a body already tormented for years by Gouda joint disease common among the aristocracy due to overconsumption of red meat, pastries, and strong wine, and combined with old age, the blood circulation in the king's limbs had slowed to a crawl. Insufficient blood supply and a weakened immune system turned the minor wound into a festering sore. And from that sore, the rot began to spread like a slow but certain curse.
Louis XIII follows Richelieu's advice, and France moves slowly away from Spain.
Day by day, the skin around the wound changed color from deep red to purple, then gray, and finally to a greasy black streak, soft to the touch like mud. At the time, royal physicians fully believed in the theory of humor balance, that illness was caused by the accumulation of strange fluids that needed to be expelled. So they kept making new incisions, heating cloth soaked in strong liquor and pressing it against the wound to draw out the toxins, sprinkling ash and vinegar on the skin to provoke recovery. But all of it only worsened the destruction of raw flesh, as necrosis spread deeper into tendon and bone. In his final months, the nauseating stench became a haunting presence throughout Versailles, clinging to velvet curtains, to hair and clothing of anyone who stepped across the threshold of the king's bedchamber. A Spanish envoy, upon returning home, recorded that the stench was as if hell had opened its mouth, slowly consuming him on his throne bed. But perhaps the most terrifying thing was not the smell, but how the disease stripped away piece by piece the dignity of a man once worshipped across Europe. Louis had once embodied strength and order. He wore armor to lead military campaigns, issued laws that shaped the court, demanded absolute obedience from his subjects. Now, He could no longer lift his leg from the mattress, could not control the discharge oozing from the wound, could not even swat away a fly landing on his neck. To survive the nights, he had to take doses of opium so high that his mind dulled. Yet even opium could not mask the numbing pain. In his rare, lucid moments, Louis looked down at the legs swollen to nearly the size of his torso, black and cracked like charred wood, and uttered short sentences, half regret, half despair. "I used to believe I was immortal," he whispered, voice raspy like wind, slipping through a half-closed window. "But flesh is still flesh. It rots like anyone else's." The doctors whispered among themselves that the gangrene had reached the shin bone, eating down to the marrow. And once infection spread that far, there was no miracle left to save him. While the court outside maintained a facade of calm, holding meetings on war and marriages, inside the sealed chamber, Louis breathed in short bursts, sometimes groaning like a trapped animal. In the final nights, the wound oozed pus constantly. Bandages changed every few hours, only to become soaked with cloudy yellow fluid minutes later. People burned incense and scattered herbs beneath the bed, hoping to cover even a fraction of the grim reality that the Sun King was decomposing in the very palace he built to assert eternity. As death drew near, Louis drifted further into delirium, at times muttering the names of long-dead ministers, at others raising his hands as if to grasp at something invisible. One night, he was heard repeating the word "forgive" over and over, but no one knew if he was pleading with God, with his people, or with himself for the endless wars that had drained France to exhaustion. And if you can picture that, a king who reigned for 72 years, who once made Europe tremble, lying beneath blankets soaked with pus and liquor, you'll understand why his death was not just the end of a man, but a death knell for the illusion of immortality. Versailles had tried so hard to paint over an entire century. The funeral of Louis XIV, on the surface, was held with all the ceremonies a great European monarch deserved. But if you stood quietly at the edge of Versailles' hallway as the funeral procession prepared to depart, you would see it resembled more an exorcism than a farewell. The coffin was hastily made of oak, draped in black velvet embroidered with gold thread. But even the thickest velvet could not stop the stench of rot from seeping through the cracks. It was said that before the lid was sealed, 8 surgeons had to struggle for hours with the body. They opened the abdomen to prepare for embalming, but with a single cut, the belly burst open from the buildup of gases. The stench engulfed the room. One physician collapsed on the floor, vomiting uncontrollably. Others had to stuff the abdominal cavity with cloth, soaked in fragrant resin and strong alcohol, then stitch it shut with thick thread, hoping to preserve the shape until burial. But the summer heat defeated all effort. As soon as the body was placed in the coffin, black fluid seeped through the wood, leaving a wet trail along the marble floor. On the morning of the procession, Versailles was strangely silent. There was no sound of servants scrubbing floors, no laughter from courtiers, no cheerful ceremonial music. Only the footsteps of gate sentries and the wind passing over dew-soaked grass. The velvet curtain covering the coffin was lifted, and thousands were finally allowed to pass by for one last look. But most only glanced briefly, handkerchiefs pressed to their noses. They dared not linger more than a few seconds, for the scent of decay was so sharp it cut at their throats, causing many to weep not from emotion, but from nausea. Someone later wrote that the moment he saw the coffin leaking black fluid, he understood the Sun King had become something profoundly mundane, a rotting corpse, no different from that of a beast. The funeral procession rolled out of Versailles at dawn. Along the cobblestone roads, the hearse was pulled by 8 black-draped horses, moving so slowly, it seemed time had halted. At the front, clergy in gold-embroidered vestments recited the funeral liturgy, their voices steady and cold. Behind them, long rows of guards and nobles rode with heads bowed in silence. Along the route, people gathered on both sides, But there were no cheers or sobs as in the king's youth. They simply stood there, gripping their hats, eyes empty, unsure whether to express sorrow, fear, or relief. An old woman trembled as she made the sign of the cross. A child buried its face in its mother's skirt. Someone turned their head away, for as soon as the hearse passed by, that sickening stench swept through the crowd like a cruel reminder that absolute power must also surrender to decay. The procession took nearly a full day to reach the Basilica of Saint Denis, the traditional resting place of French kings. Night fell. Torchlight flickered against the walls of ancient buildings, casting the shadows of the mourners. As the coffin was lowered into the crypt, many covered their faces with cloth. In the cold, damp darkness of the stone vault, bishops dressed in white vestments performed the final rites, sprinkling holy water and aromatic oils in an effort to drown the odor of death. The prayers echoed down the desolate chamber, blending with the sound of dripping water and the trembling breaths of the few servants who remained. The coffin lid was finally sealed with iron nails. The sound of the hammer striking the wood echoed again and again, like the final punctuation mark of an era. As the casket was slowly lowered into the stone-lined pit, the final prayers came to an end, and a chilling silence stretched out. A long-serving attendant burst into tears. But those tears stirred nothing in the cold air around him. The death of Louis XIV was not a grand tragedy filled with sympathy, was more like a quiet warning that no throne stands high enough to escape the ultimate truth: all flesh decays. As the last visitors left Saint Denis, Versailles remained lit through the night, as if trying to preserve a trace of its former glory. But everything had changed. The king who once declared himself the sun had perished in a stench of death. His successors would inherit the throne and also the debts of war, famine, and a populace who no longer believed in any kind of eternity. That night, France officially closed the door on a century of delusion and began to awaken to the true cost of unlimited power. As that night closed, Versailles still trembled in the scent of incense, with the throne draped in black velvet and the echo of quiet prayers lingering in the air. Some said that even though Louis XIV had departed this world, his presence still lingered behind the curtains, within the stone tiles of the halses, if a part of his iron will refuse to vanish, along with his rotting body. But to understand why that man became the very symbol of absolute power and why he collapsed in such utter loneliness, we must turn back time to the beginning of his life, a childhood worshipped as divine, yet imprisoned in a gilded cage of ambition. Louis XIV was born on the 5th of September, 1638, the son of King Louis XIII and Queen Anne of Austria. He was not an easily born child. His mother had suffered several miscarriages and had nearly lost hope of producing a male heir. That is why, when Anne gave birth to a healthy baby after 23 years of marriage, all of France celebrated in a grand ceremony, calling him Dieudonné, God-given. From that moment on, Louis's fate no longer belonged to himself. He was a symbol, proof of divine blessing upon the Bourbon dynasty. As a child, Louis lived under strict protection. He was rarely allowed to play like other children. Every step, every gesture was trained to match the position of the chosen one. From a young age, he had to wear miniature ceremonial robes, don a powdered wig, learn to keep his back straight and look people in the eye, for a king must never bow his head. Anne of Austria was deeply devout and politically anxious. She tried to raise Louis as a perfect model, humble before God, yet unyielding before any subject. But that piety, combined with fear of overthrow, instilled in the child a deep-rooted loneliness, a sense that he was not a person, but a sacrificial object worshipped by the entire court. In 1643, when Louis was not yet 5 years old, King Louis XIII died after a long struggle with tuberculosis. The coronation was held immediately, in an atmosphere that was both mournful and lavish. A blonde-haired boy, his hands trembling as he held the scepter, officially became King Louis XIV of France. But real power then rested in the hands of his mother and Cardinal Mazarin, an astute Italian statesman whom Louis XIII had entrusted with the regency before his death. Louis's childhood was overshadowed by noble rebellions and unrest in Paris. The Fronde uprisings, from 1648 to 1653, insurrections erupted across the land. Many nights, the young king had to flee with his mother, hiding in the dark corridors of temporary castles, listening to militias pounding at the gates and curses rising from the markets. In that tender soul, Louis internalized a harsh lesson. When the throne is weak, the people dare to revolt. And when the royal family appears lenient, the nobles demand more privileges. That memory would later become the root of his unwavering belief in absolute monarchy, a belief that a king must never show even a single crack. In 1661, Cardinal Mazarin died. Louis was 22 years old. To many at court, he seemed a handsome but timid young man, expected to quickly appoint a new chief minister to rule on his behalf. But Louis stunned all of France when he declared, "I will govern alone." No new prime minister was appointed. The young king stepped into the political arena with unrelenting resolve to make the throne the unquestioned center of the nation. He began reforming the court, demanding that all decisions pass through him. He transformed Versailles from a swampy hunting lodge into the most magnificent palace in Europe, a colossal stage for displaying the eternity of Bourbon power. In daily rituals, his every move was dramatized into ceremony: waking, dressing, dining. Attending Massal became performances to remind everyone that the king was the living embodiment of the state. But beneath that glittering shell, Louis remained the child who once fled in terror from rebellion. The fear of collapse drove him to control every corner. He waged endless wars to expand territory and reinforce his prestige: the Dutch War, the War of the Spanish Succession, and countless other brutal conflicts. Each victory was hailed as a triumph of the dynasty. But the cost was a drained treasury, millions dead from famine, and simmering resentment across the provinces. Because of this, when Louis grew old and illness came knocking, no one had the courage to tell him the truth. People feared his power so much that they preferred to let him die slowly in bed rather than urge him to let go. And that was the deepest tragedy life built to preserve prestige. But when the final breath escaped, only the cold of a sealed chamber and an unshakable stench of death remained. If you listen closely tonight, you might still feel that chill slip into your sleep, a reminder that even kings who call themselves the sun are, in the end, just lonely children searching for a way not to be forgotten. And if we look deeper into that 70-year reign beyond the dazzling portraits, we'll see that the political system Louis XIV so painstakingly constructed also bore the same rot as the gangrene in his leg. From the moment he declared he would rule alone, Louis understood that a king's greatest power lay not only in armies or gold, but in the ability to break the will of anyone who dared imagine themselves equal to the throne. That's why he turned Versailles into a vast engine of control, where every duke, count, and marquise, no matter how illustrious, was forced to live within his orbit, so that each morning, upon waking, they were already made small by the radiance of the Sun King. You might picture Versailles not merely as a palace, but as the grandest stage European politics has ever seen. Each day, Louis choreographed suffocatingly precise rituals: the lever, waking ceremony; attending mass; dining; the coucher, bedtime ceremony. Who was permitted to hand him his robe? Who could sit as he put on his shoes? Who was allowed to stand near his bedevilry detail became a tool for stratifying status. The nobility's pride was shattered into fragments, and to retain even a sliver of dignity, they willingly bowed to his every demand. Beneath this surface, Louis was conducting a taming of the aristocracy. He stripped them of their right to collect local taxes, replacing them with civil servants of humble birth known as intendants, functionaries loyal only to the throne, indebted to no lord. In the eyes of modern historians, this was one of the greatest advances in creating a centralized monarchy. But to the French people at the time, it felt like growing distance and tightening tyranny. Louis believed that uniformity in appearance meant uniformity in thought. He harshly suppressed Protestantism. In 1685, he issued the Edict of Fontainebleau, revoking religious freedom for the Huguenots, closing their churches, and forcing hundreds of thousands to convert or flee the country. Tens of thousands of merchant families, skilled craftsmen, and military officers emigrated to the Netherlands, England, and Prussia, taking with them knowledge and capital, leaving behind an economic hole that would take France decades to mend. But to Louis, it was a necessary price for one faith, one king, one France. Oh, he also expanded a network of spies and secret police. The private letters of nobles were intercepted, read, and copied. Reports hundreds of pages long were sent straight to the king's desk, detailing who complained about meals, who joked about taxes, who dared to criticize the endless wars. Under the lights of Versailles, no secret lasted long. Every smile could become evidence of disloyalty. Louis's foreign policy bore the same mark of insatiable ambition. He once declared, "I love war as a man loves a woman." Over his 72-year reign, he launched or joined so many wars they became impossible to count. He fought the Dutch, Austrians, English, and Spanish. Each French victory brought all-night feasts at court, fireworks, and the carving of triumphs into city gates. But behind the celebrations were depleted treasuries, crushing taxes on the poor, and villages left in ruins by conscription. Even so, Louis managed to maintain the aura of the King of Kings for decades, largely thanks to his unmatched skill in propaganda and stagecraft. He commissioned hundreds of official portraits, all depicting a towering, regal man in deep blue robes lined with ermine, holding a scepter. Yet by the final years of his life, his body had weakened so much he could barely stand for more than a few minutes. He still received visitors on the throne, but it was draped with embroidered cloth to hide his trembling legs, his platformed shoes, and the gout-swollen belly. When Louis was finally bedridden, everything rituals, policiers, wars converged on a single point, the throne bed, where he was both prisoner of gangrene and supreme monarch. The grand ministers still came and stood in rows around the bed, reading reports on taxes and diplomacy, pretending the nation still functioned smoothly. But in truth, French politics then resembled his body still wrapped in velvet and perfumed, but already rotting from within. Perhaps that was the greatest tragedy of Louis XIV. He spent his entire life constructing a seamless structure of power, an unprecedentedly splendid centralized state, but sowed exhaustion and resentment in the hearts of his people. And when he closed his eyes, no ceremony was grand enough to fill the gaping ruin left by the wars, the repressive policies, and the merciless taxes. That night, France lost the king who called himself the sun. But that light had long become the flame that scorched all hope. If you want to imagine politics under Louis XIV, picture a massive painting where the king is the sun at the center, radiating a light that both mesmerizes and burns everything it touches. His reign is considered the pinnacle of European absolutism, a form of government in which all will and authority converged on a single man. From a young age, Louis understood that to prevent a repeat of the Fronde rebellions that had once forced him to flee as a child, he had to build a throne that could never be shaken. And to do that, he transformed the state into a sophisticated machine powered by fear, ceremony, surveillance, and the illusions he cultivated for a lifetime. Louis famously declared, "I am the state." This was not a boast but a serious political proclamation. At its core was the philosophy of absolute monarchy. All legal, judicial, financial, and diplomatic power emanated from the king, and no one had the right to stand as his equal. While in England, constitutional monarchy was beginning to take shape. In France, Louis raised the throne so high that every subject had to look up. He launched a series of reforms to consolidate control. First, Louis systematically stripped the feudal lords of their autonomous powers, where once local nobles could levy taxes, maintain private armies, and hold their own courts. Now, all of that was replaced by a network of royal officials called intendants, These bureaucrats were not nobles but often lawyers or civil servants, selected by Louis for their absolute loyalty to the throne. They were responsible for tax collection, law enforcement, grain management, and local surveillance. This allowed Louis to monitor the country in extraordinary detail, from the smallest crop failure to suspicious gatherings. Another pillar of his political structure was the control of ceremony and image. He understood that power was not only enforced by steel or edicts, but by worship. Versailles was not just a palace, it was a grand stage on which Louis cast himself as a near-divine figure. Each morning, nobles lined up to serve him, to help him dress, being to put on his stockings, or simply to witness him awaken. Whoever stood closest to the bed was the most honored, every small role offering a wash basin, carrying a chair, holding a sleeve became a fiercely contested privilege among dozens of noble houses. With Versailles, Louis weakened the nobility, not just through law, but through psychological dependency. He transformed men who once led armies and governed vast territories into a retinue tethered year-round to the palace, gradually losing the ability to rule their lands and growing entirely dependent on royal favor. For over 50 years, Versailles was both the theater of glory and the velvet prison of the French aristocracy. In foreign affairs, Louis XIV pursued an aggressive hegemonic policy. Believing France should hold central power in Europe, he initiated many wars that history would later call the Wars of Louis XIV. Notably, the Dutch War, 1672-1678, intended to punish the Dutch for resisting French influence. The War of the League of Augsburg, 1688-1697, against a coalition of European powers alarmed by his ambition. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701-1714, to place his grandson on the Spanish throne. These wars sometimes brought glory and victory for Louis, but their dark side was ballooning national debt, crushing taxes on the populace, and rural areas devastated by conscription. It was in this context that quiet resentment began to form, the very ember that would ignite the French Revolution decades after his death. Another political dimension of his reign was religious repression. Louis saw religion as a tool to unify ideology. In 1685, he signed the Edict of Fontainebleau, revoking the religious freedom of the Huguenots, Protestants, destroying their churches, and forcing hundreds of thousands to convert or flee. The long-term result was the loss of talented merchants, artisans, and officers, weakening both the economy and the military. But to Louis, religious unity outweighed any loss. Even so, it cannot be denied that Louis XIV possessed an extraordinary talent. He maintained absolute power for over 70 years, was never overthrown, and never let control slip from his hands. While he lived, no one dared to oppose him openly. The grandees bowed their heads, the nobility competed for favors, and the common people paid taxes and cursed under their breath. But when the golden lights of Versailles dimmed, when the black dripping coffin was lowered into the crypt, everyone finally saw the truth. Louis's politics were those of dazzling appearances rooted in fear, borrowed glory, and endless, ruinous wars. And just like the gangrenous legs he died with, behind the shining velvet was a spreading wound that would destroy the French feudal order just a few decades later. If politics under Louis XIV was built upon ritual and absolute control, then the economy of his reign was another stage where dazzling light concealed cracks that quietly widened over 7 decades. From the earliest years after assuming real power, Louis understood that absolute rule could not exist without a steady flow of money to fund armies, sustain the court, build palaces, and stage the grand ceremonies he saw as his greatest tools of persuasion. Thus, Louis XIV's reign became a period of both economic expansion and financial crisis unprecedented in French history. One of the key pillars of his economic policy was mercantilisme doctrine, focused on accumulating precious metals, protecting domestic production, and boosting exports. His most famous finance minister, Jean-Baptiste de Colbert, designed this entire system with a firm belief that France could become the strongest economy in Europe if the state controlled all resources. Colbert established royal manufactories, manufactures royales, to produce luxury goods, Aubusson tapestries, glass and mirrors, Lyon silk, Sèvres porcelain, all meant to replace expensive imports from Italy and the Netherlands. He offered subsidies, tax exemption, and monopolies to encourage industrial growth, creating hundreds of thousands of new jobs. On the surface, France was hailed as the commercial hub of the continent, with bustling markets and flourishing craftsmanship, but beneath that prosperous facade, the French economy was overly dependent on protectionism and overlapping privileges. Some workshops thrived thanks to favoritism, while most peasants and independent craftsmen remained impoverished and excluded. The heaviest burden came from taxes. Louis XIV maintained a court of nearly 10,000 people at Versailles and commanded the largest standing army in Europe, up to 400,000 troops at the height of war. To sustain this massive machine, the state imposed numerous taxes on salt, gabelle, land, wine, consumption, all of which fell mostly on peasants and small merchants. Meanwhile, the nobility and clergy enjoyed extensive exemptions and privileges. These groups paid little or no direct taxes, only symbolic contributions. By the end of Louis's reign, this tax injustice had become a simmering grievance, planting seeds for reform and revolution. Another destabilizing factor was constant warfare. Every conflict Louis initiated devoured mountains of silver and gold. For example, during the War of the Spanish Succession, military spending and subsidies for allies nearly emptied the treasury. Massive loans from private banks and domestic creditors caused public debt to soar. In the provinces, new taxes fell like a flood. In some years, peasants sold livestock, land, even their children to pay dues. Once prosperous regions like Normandy and Burgundy suffered crop failures, famine, and epidemics. At the same time, Louis never curtailed lavish spending at court. Versailles consumed an enormous budget not just to build but to maintain annually: heating, lighting, banquet, fireworks, and salaries for thousands of servants, musicians, gardeners, tailors, and guilders. Even in the best economic years, France struggled to carry all these costs. Colbert tried to balance the books by reforming tax systems and customs. But after his death, his successors lacked the discipline to maintain fiscal order. As a result, the royal treasury plunged into crisis by the final years of Louis's reign. The state began issuing debt notes, borrowing from wealthy merchants, and selling titles and offices for cash. Another economic tragedy was the Huguenot exodus, when Louis issued the Edict of Fontainebleau. Around 200,000 Protestants, many of them merchants, weavers, blacksmiths, fled France. They took with them capital, skills, and trade networks. The result was a significant collapse in productivity and tax revenue. While the crown refused to reverse its policies, all of this gave the economy under Louis XIV a double face. On one side, the glamour of Versailles banquets, the celebrated triumphs of war. On the other, depleted fields, starving people, and a ballooning public debt like a festering wound. If Louis XIV's politics were woven from ritual and fear, his economy greased by heavy taxation, then his military was the sword he never ceased to draw for over half a century. In the king's eyes, war was not just a last resort of diplomacy, it was the ultimate instrument to showcase the grandeur of the Bourbon throne. Someone once said, Louis loved war as he loved the golden sunlight gleaming on his brocade cloak. From a young age, he nurtured a dream of European dominance. He believed France should not settle for its current borders but expand beyond the Pyrenees, or reach into Habsburg lands, and push back Spanish and Austrian influence. To realize this ambition, Louis XIV built one of the most formidable military machines of the early modern world, a force that made the entire continent wary. When he assumed full power in 1661, France's army was not particularly distinguished compared to its neighbors, but over decades, thanks to reforms in discipline, logistics, and training, it grew so powerful that at its peak, it could mobilize over 400,000 troops, a number unprecedented in Europe. This was France's first large-scale standing army, comprising not just noble officers but mercenaries, professional infantry, artillerymen, and then celebrated military engineers. Louis XIV did not lead troops directly like medieval kings, but he controlled every strategic decision through war councils and trusted generals. Most crucial was the presence of Sébastien le Prestre de Vauban, a master of fortification who turned the art of siege and defense into a precise science. Vauban constructed dozens of star-shaped fortresses along France's borders, reinforced strongholds, and designed an unprecedented logistics network. Thanks to this system, French forces could endure grueling campaigns without fear of supply shortages. Throughout his reign, Louis XIV engaged in numerous wars. The War of Devolution, 1667-1668, was the first trial he invoked his wife's inheritance rights to claim Spanish Netherlands territory. French troops advanced swiftly, seized many strongholds, and forced the enemy to sign a treaty ceding land. But this was only the beginning. He soon launched the Dutch War, 1672-1678, a brutal campaign to crush the wealthy Dutch Republic and assert France's unmatched power. French armies stormed across the Dutch border, capturing city after city. But eventually, a European coalition united against him, dragging the war into a prolonged, bloody affair. Though France gained some territory, the massive costs sounded an alarm over the treasury's exhaustion. The War of the League of Augsburg, 1688-1697, soon erupted, as the royal courts of Europe, alarmed by Louis's growing power, banded together against him. The Sun King's army maintained its edge thanks to iron discipline and sophisticated siege systems. Each campaign season, endless supply trains hauled food, ammunition, gear and armor from deep within France to the front lines. Once again, Vauban played a pivotal role. Fortresses repeatedly helped French forces thwart counterattacks. But the most expensive and drawn-out conflict was the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701-1714, a gamble to place Louis's grandson on the Spanish throne. It was a war that shook all of Europe for over a decade. French troops clashed with the Austrian-British-Dutch alliance. Fierce battles like Blenheim and Ramillies claimed tens of thousands of lives. Even in his twilight years, Louis stubbornly refused to retreat. Though the nation was exhausted, the people embittered, and taxes reached unprecedented levels. One remarkable trait was the iron discipline of Louis's army. Generals like Turenne and Luxembourg were notorious for their severity. Military orders were issued like divine commandments. Disobedience was not tolerated. In the camps, minor offenses meant flogging. Serious crimes could result in execution before the ranks, harsh though it was. This discipline gave the French army an advantage in organization and endurance. Yet this boundless military ambition came at a grave cost. Campaign after campaign drained the treasury and plunged the economy into perpetual crisis. For decades, rural France saw nothing but passing soldiers, military taxes, looting, and disease. Conscription calls bled the labor force dry, and while the court boasted of victories, the people saw only abandoned fields and crumbling homes. At the end of his life, as Louis lay motionless on his gangrenous bed, he still issued orders to continue fighting. Once, in a hoarse voice, he told his generals, "We must uphold the honor of the House of Bourbonlay. No one scorn France." These words echoed like the final cry of a rain that believed military glory was the proof of immortality. But when the final breath was drawn, and the old battlefield sank into cold mist, the true legacy became clear. A France depleted, drowned in debt, deeply divided, with the seeds of revolt germinating in the hearts of the poor, those who would one day carry the banners of revolution just a few generations later. And so, while Louis XIV's mighty armies marched across European borders, while Versailles gleamed through the night with fireworks and balls, another France, silent and suffering, endured just outside the gilded walls. This was the France of common folk, peasants, craftsmen, laborers, those who were never mentioned in victory chronicles, yet bore the highest cost for the king's dreams of power. If you step beyond Paris or Lyon, away from the grand boulevards, and followed the dusty roads leading to villages in Burgundy or Languedoc, you'd see a very different picture. Most homes had thatched roofs, cracked mud walls, windows no larger than air vents because window taxes were based on size. In winter, cold wind pierced through the gaps in the walls, and people burned dry straw for heat, the choking smoke making children cough violently. In summer, dust clouded the air, and the fields cracked dry, for there were not enough men or oxen to plow. Many of the able-bodied had been drafted into the army. Peasant life was a chain of endless taxes. To sell a bit of wheat at market, they paid a market tax. To keep livestock, they paid a livestock tax. To grind grain, they paid to use the Lord's mill. Then there was the salt tax, gabellione, of the most hated levies, requiring every person, from child to elder, to buy a minimum amount of salt at exorbitant prices, whether they needed it or not. State tax collectors often arrived with thick ledgers and iron rods, banging on any door late with payments, unafraid to seize pots, pigs, even beds to settle debts. And it wasn't just taxes. The endless wars drained human life. At the peak of recruitment, village after village was left with widows and orphans. As the men marched off to distant borders, those who left rarely returned. Those who stayed behind to farm the land found it could no longer sustain their families. In the harsh winter of 1709, an extraordinary cold spell struck. Rivers froze, crops died, and hundreds of thousands perished from hunger or exhaustion. Meanwhile, Versailles held victory balls. Red wine shimmered on banquet tables, and fresh tapestries cushioned the feet of honored guests. Even the wealthier market towns were not spared. Artisans, weavers, shoemakers struggled to survive amid religious crackdowns and the deluge of taxation. When the Edict of Fontainebleau was enacted, tens of thousands of Huguenots fled, causing the collapse of once thriving workshops. Those who remained lost clients, lost skilled co-workers, and lived in fear of denunciation if they failed to attend Catholic Mass. Among the urban middle class, merchants and traders fared little better. Customs and internal taxes overlapped. Every shipment that passed through provinces incurred inspection fees, protection fees, tolls. Each time wheat prices rose, bread prices followed, and the poor would storm bakeries, crying out over their only meal being taken away. Small-scale food riots flared up and were swiftly crushed. No ringleader survived past a single winter. And yet, for 70 years, the court continually proclaimed its great achievements: expanded territory, splendid palaces, renown across Europe. But behind the velvet curtain of Versailles, the empire had begun to fracture. Village churches stood abandoned as residents starved or fled. Fields lay fallow for lack of laborers, and dark alleyways sheltered ragged children curled up on straw mats. It is said that as Louis lay dying, there were whispered remarks that he was finally paying for the nation's debts. These debts were not just gold and silver borrowed, but a life built on the hardship of millions. And when his last breath faded, a sigh of relief spread across the Provincessa. Relief. No one dared speak aloud. Tonight, if you quietly close your eyes, try to listen to the murmurs of Versailles, where every flagstone, every silk curtain was paid for with the sweat, tears, and lifeblood of nameless people. They are not etched into monuments. No statues of them stand in squares. Yet they were the ones who carried on their backs the weight of Europe's most dazzling empire, and it was they, through hunger and fury, who sowed the seeds for the coming storm of revolution. A storm that would sweep away every throne, every brocade, and every myth of eternal glory. And while the poor slumped over in withered fields, while tax collectors roamed villages seeking the last coins hidden in threadbare pockets, at Versailles, an entirely different world gleamed through the night as if nothing mattered in the world but the vanity woven from gold, velvet, and elaborate ritual. This was the world of the nobility, lives governed from birth to death by the order and performance Louis XIV had choreographed with flawless precision. If you walked through those long candlelit corridors and quietly peered past the velvet drapes into the salons of Versailles, you'd see hundreds of powdered faces, towering wigs like spires, shoulders draped in gold-threaded robes, and glittering red-heeled shoes. They spoke in lofty nasal tones, traded gossip, and competed for hollow praise, because here, every glance and every word could determine a family's fate, their lives. At first glance, might seem like paradise, endless feasts, nightly balls, wine sparkling in crystal goblets, melodies flowing from the royal orchestra, but it was merely the shimmering surface of a social structure stretched to the point of sickness. Beneath the splendor, the nobility of Versailles were prisoners in a strange game of survival-alone, where the prize was royal favor, and the cost of failure was exile from the courtly orbit into oblivion. Louis XIV understood well how to tame those who once ruled lands of their own. Instead of forbidding them, he gave them everything: apartments grander than their ancestral castles, extravagant stipend, lavish praise. But in exchange, they had to live permanently at Versailles. They no longer governed estates, no longer led private armies. Every morning, they woke under one another's watchful eyes. Who would be called to the king's room first? Who would fasten his coat? Who would be invited to sit near him at dinner? What seemed trivial was in fact life or death. A single approving glance from Louis could transform a modest family into a mighty house with new titles and lands. One slip of the tongue could doom an entire lineage stripped of income, honor, and presence at court. Thus Versailles became a vast theatre noble, a masked performer, surviving through fear wrapped in lace and feathers. They spent their days on rituals so elaborate they bordered on the absurd. Each morning, dozens crowded the lever the king's waking ceremony. All hoped for the chance to hold the wash basin, hand him a towel, or simply receive a nod from Louis. By day, they joined royal hunts, dances, and tennis matches. By night, it was back to balls, theater, and banquets lasting until dawn. Yet their lives were far from peaceful. Subtle rivalry haunted every conversation, every glance. They scrutinized each other relentlessly. Who wore the newest gown? Who spent the most on a feast? Who basked in the king's favor? Vanity became law, and that law allowed no room for weakness. It was said that some dukes spent their entire fortune just to commission the most splendid outfit, hoping Louis might notice them for a fleeting moment in the hallway. There were families who, under crushing debt, secretly mortgaged their ancestral lands. Still, they wore silk robes, adorned with jeweled rings, laughed and danced at banquets, but behind closed doors, they sat in silence beside towering ledgers of debt, never knowing when disaster would strike. In the Versailles game, no one was allowed to show a crack. The lives of the nobility were also bound by strict, invisible rules. From hairstyles, posture, the way one bowed, to who was allowed to sit while the king stood, everything was meticulously regulated. A minor mistake could become an excuse for others to bring one down. Many fell into chronic anxiety, insomnia, paranoia, and sought solace in strong drink, gambling, or dangerous clandestine affairs. And yet, strangely, Versailles gave them the illusion of immortality, that as long as the king acknowledged them As long as they appeared at the banquet, their reputation would endure. But the truth was that when Louis XIV closed his eyes, the stars of countless noble houses dimmed instantly. With a new king on the throne, a new order was immediately established, and those once favored fell from grace like moths burned by the candle's flame. Perhaps the quietest tragedy of the nobility under the Sun King was that they were no longer powerful lords, no longer the masters of their land or destiny. They became secondary actors in a single drama, to praise Louis, to nourish Louis's glory, and to fade with his insatiable ambition. When Louis XIV drew his final breath in the early morning of the 1st of September, 1715, after 70 years of rule, it was said that the light of an era had gone out. But for many, it was not the radiant sunset of a glorious reign, but the gray dawn of an exhausted France. The velvet-draped coffin was lowered into the royal crypt amid prayers, and as the lid was sealed, Versailles suddenly felt different, as if all the laughter, music, and endless balls had merely been a painted veneer over a rotting wall. For days after the funeral, people across the provinces and the outskirts of Paris whispered about the stench rising from the sun, King's decaying corpsey final haunting image. A cruel symbol, power rotted to the bone. But as the odor faded, a harsh reality emerged. Louis had left behind a mighty empire on the map of Europe, but beneath the surface lay deep fissures, an empty treasury, a mountain of public debt, a starving population, and a nobility bankrupted by their efforts to maintain the Versailles lifestyle. The heir to the throne, Louis XV, was only a 5-year-old child, far too young to grasp the empire he had inherited teetered on the brink of collapse. The regency passed to Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, who immediately sought to appease public opinion and repair the damage. The first reforms were announced with promises to restore the economy and ease the tax burden, but the people's trust had been worn down to the bone. In the countryside, after decades of war and drought, houses lay in ruins, fields were abandoned, families that had survived the winter of 1709, a cold so brutal birds froze mid-flight, had yet to recover. People left their villages for Paris to beg or join bands of wanderers. In the city, bread prices remained so high that a small loaf, enough to feed one person for a day, had become a luxury for tens of thousands of families. Incidents of robbery and scattered uprisings serrated a sign that the simmering discontent from Louis XIV's reign had never truly died out. Even the nobility, once seemingly untouchable, suddenly found themselves disoriented, realizing they no longer held their former position. After decades of being bound to Versailles, pouring their fortunes into the ceremonial game, they discovered the throne no longer held enough authority to save them from bankruptcy. Many families were drowning in debt, with no land left to mortgage, only expensive brocade garments and hollow honor. Versailles, the center of their universe, had become an empty stage. The lights gone out, and no one left to applaud. The Regency faced the task of rebuilding almost from nothing. To restore the budget, they turned to a Scottish financier named John Law, who established a national bank and a new credit system. At first, his idea of injecting paper money into circulation revived trade. France experienced a brief period of prosperity, a light breath after the long storm. But soon, the financial bubble swelled beyond control. The Mississippi Company's stock frenzy exploded, and when it burst, it left thousands of families ruined, sowing even deeper distrust in a society already drained of hope. In foreign affairs, the post-Louis XIV era was a time when France had to show more humility after a series of costly wars. Military strength remained, but reputation was no longer a solid shield. Neighboring countries, once fearful of the French army, he now saw Paris as an empire slowly bleeding out. In international conferences, France had to concede more, negotiate harder, and relinquish some territorial ambitions in exchange for peace and a chance at reconstruction. Yet the most profound change was not on the map of Europe, but in the hearts of the people. For nearly a century, The population had been nourished by the myth of Louis XIV, King of Light, who made France the center of the world. But now, with the truth exposed, they realized that behind the gilded robe was a regime that had sacrificed the well-being of millions to maintain the illusion of power. Vows of loyalty and celebratory festivals had become nothing more than awkward memories. Perhaps the most bitter truth was that even in death, Louis XIV's Versailles still stood imposingly over the old fields, reminding everyone that a dynasty could build an entire dazzling world and bury it under the weight of boundless ambition. The people no longer looked at the palace with admiration, but with a gaze mixed with anger and suspicion. From those looks, the seeds of resistance began to sprout, quietly taking root in the heart of French society. Tonight, if you close your eyes and imagine the halls of Versailles, you might hear the footsteps of a vanished era, the whisper of silk gowns on marble, the murmurs of scheming, the courtly music that once drowned the moans of the poor. And when all falls silent, only one question lingers. What did that power, that glory, ultimately buy besides a mountain of debt and a fury no dynasty could appease? France, after Louis XIV, did not collapse overnight. It entered a dark and uncertain and heavy period like a wounded beast, still able to move, but never to heal. And from those wounds, another storm would form, a storm called revolution, waiting for the day it would sweep away every throne, every velvet curtain, every lie about eternal glory. The court, once organized like a perfect machine, suddenly fell out of sync. For 72 years, Louis XIV had held everything in his hand. She was the final decision maker, the arbiter of all disputes, the dispenser and retractor of favor. When he was gone, those who once knelt for his command suddenly no longer knew where to turn for answers. Ministers, once loyal subordinates, now split into factions vying for influence around an empty throne. They whispered schemes in the shadows of Versailles, a place once filled with light, knowing full well that a child on the throne could not uphold the iron discipline Louis had forged over a lifetime. Meanwhile, the common people had no time to worry about court ceremonies. They faced the aftermath of decades of war and crushing taxation. Once prosperous lands along the Loire were now scarred by conflict-abandoned fields, blackened houses, scattered villagers. In Paris, thousands crowded into slums near the city gates, living off charity and overpriced crusts of bread. They were too exhausted to rebel, yet too desperate to endure much longer. The Versailles nobility, after a lifetime confined within the palace, no longer knew where to find their role. They still wore brocade coats, still powdered their wigs, but under the thick makeup was confusion. With Louis gone, there was no grand stage on which to perform their acts of loyalty and splendor. A few rushed back to their estates, hoping to reclaim their family's influence. But they had been away from the people too long. Stripped of real power, those who lingered at court lived in debt, fooling themselves that the golden days of the court would soon return. In the earliest council meetings under Regent Philippe d'Orléans, a strange atmosphere prevailed. Ministers, once accustomed to Louis's decisive judgments, now argued for hours. Reports of financial crisis, famine, and social unrest were read, then folded away, no one bold enough to act. With each passing day, the shadow of the late king grew more distant. Once the heart of the state, he now served as a heavy reminder of debts and mistakes the future must bear. Perhaps the most emblematic image of France at that time was Versailles itself. By day, the palace still gleamed, corridors lit with mirrored light, manicured gardens, guards standing in perfect rows. But by night, candle dimmed. The empty halls echoed with footsteps. Servants silently dusted portraits of Louis XIV in ermine robes, scepter in hand. No one dared say it aloud, but all understood. The boundless power that once blazed had gone out, and no one remained great enough to replace it. In the provinces, complaints turned into whispered stories. People recalled the winter of 1000, 709. When tens of thousands froze to death while the royal court launched fireworks to celebrate a military victory. They spoke of peasant families selling their own children to pay the salt tax. These stories traveled from coachmen to taverns, from blacksmiths to fishmongers. With each retelling, they became sharper, like a small blade slicing through the layers of powder and rouge worn by the aristocracy and court. But collapse did not come immediately. France still had enough strength to prolong a period of instability, temporarily patched up with half-hearted reforms and new loans. In the years after Louis, the courtiers tried various means to revive the nation, reducing ceremony, loosening trade controls, seeking peace with former enemies. Yet the chasm of debt and resentment was too wide to fill with a few edicts and words of reassurance on late afternoons at Versailles. As the red sun sank behind the gardens, people began to realize that Louis XIV had left behind more than architecture and territory. He had left behind a grim lesson, that absolute power, no matter how adorned with brocade and ritual, remains a fragile illusion. When the hand that grips it is gone, everything vanishes, revealing wounds no throne can cover. If during Louis XIV's reign the French still feared and revered power, by the time of Louis XV, that faith had worn thin. People began to mock the court, calling the king le bien-aimé, the beloved, only to laugh behind his back. In Paris, cafés became places of debate. Secret newspapers and banned books circulated hand to hand, spreading new ideas of liberty, equality, and human rights, words considered heretical just a generation earlier. Then Louis XVI ascended the throne, a kind, mild young man, with little ambition and not enough strength to restore the monarchy's crumbling prestige. He inherited a country with two faces. One side the dazzling Versailles, the other a countryside ruined by taxation and war. He also inherited a colossal debt, a debt that began with Louis XIV, piled higher by his descendants, and now beyond the means of any government to repay. By the late 1780s, the national treasury was so depleted there was no money to pay soldiers or buy grain for famine relief. The middle-class lawyers, merchants, officials had grown quietly strong and began asking, how could a country sustain a palace like Versailles yet fail to feed its people? Why did those who worked hardest pay the most taxes, while nobles and clergy lived in indulgence? And then, in the spring of 1789, those questions erupted into action. When the state summoned the Etats Generaux, the Assembly of the Three Estates, addressed the financial crisis. The delegates of the Third Estate, representing the commoners and bourgeoisie, realized they outnumbered and outwilled all others. In the Jeu de Paume Hall, they swore not to disband until France had a new constitution, a public challenge to the absolute power that had reigned for centuries. Within weeks, Paris became a furnace. Rumors spread that royal troops would crush the National Assembly. On the 14th of July, an enraged crowd stormed the Bastille, the dark symbol of tyranny. They broke the gates, freed the prisoners, beheaded the prison commander. The tricolor flag appeared. Gunfire rang out. A new era had begun. The countryside was no longer silent. Peasants rose up, burned tax records, seized estates, toppled feudal symbols. Nobles fled. Once proud families now panicked, packing silver, hiding family trees, fleeing to England, Prussia, Austria, hoping for protection. Versailles, Louis XIV's palace, that became an empty shell, a symbol of opulence, adrift in a tidal wave of change. It's said that when the Constituent Assembly abolished noble privileges and declared the end of feudalism, many counts and dukes sat speechless in gloomy salons, unable to utter a word. They had never imagined that just months after a harsh winter, all the power, ritual, and rank their ancestors had revered for centuries could vanish like mist. But the revolution didn't stop at reform. It dismantled the monarchy itself. Louis XVI, great-grandson of Louis XIV, became the final victim of the royal legacy. In January 1793, he was led to the guillotine. The blade fell amid cheers, severing the last myth of the Bourbon line. A republic was born, ushering in a stormy age where no throne was deemed sacred. And if tonight you close your eyes and trace the story that began with Louis XIV, child once hailed as Dieudonné, the gift of God, you will see the full tragedy of a dynasty, from the glittering heights of Versailles, through blood-soaked wars and merciless taxes, to the cold morning when the last king lost his head before the crowd. Perhaps the bitterest truth is not that the throne was overturned, but that the truth was revealed. All the rituals, all the praises of eternal glory were just masks. And when the mask fell, only a broken nation remained. They, a people so hungry for justice, they were willing to burn history to the ground just to start anew. And so, when the guillotine's blade dropped, it was not only Louis XVI's head that fell into the basket, but an entire old world that collapsed with it. The Parisians packed into Place de la Concorde that day could hardly grasp what they were witnessing, for in that chilling moment of silence after the cut, centuries of divine monarchite power that once made Europe bow was reduced to a mere mortal corpse. Yet with the fall of the throne, Shays did not vanish. It only changed its name to Republic. In its early years, France found no peace. The dreams of liberty and equality were quickly swept away in political storms and bloody purges. Across the provinces, revolutionary forces in blue coats hunted the remnants of nobility and clergy, smashed chateaux, burned family records, and declared a new order built on the ashes of Versailles. In Paris, the atmosphere grew thick with fear and envy. A single accusation was enough to have someone arrested, convicted of counter-revolutionary crimes, and marched to the guillotine. The very people who once raised their hands in vows for liberty were now consumed by suspicion. The halls of the National Convention echoed with slogans and fist-pounding, while in the streets, people quietly hid crusts of bread and whispered of the Sunday era as a lost time, though it had been unjust and brutal. There was a bitter paradox then. The same poor who had once been drained by Louis XIV and his descendants were now the first to realize that liberty had not brought them bread. In many villages, people could not understand why, after the throne had been smashed and lords hanged, the granaries were still empty, and their children still dying of cold and hunger. Whispers spread. The revolution is no different from the crown. It demands taxes, conscript soldiers, and Zeitz's food. Ember. Meanwhile, Versailles, this palace Louis XIV built to display immortal power, lay abandoned like a ruin. The cold marble steps no longer echoed with the clack of red-heeled shoes. Velvet tapestries, silver-framed mirrors, and mythological statues were dismantled, auctioned off, or destroyed to erase all traces of the Ancien Regime. The grand banquet halls, once alive with masquerades, now gathered dust, their windows shattered, walls damp with mold. Some said Versailles died with Louis, and no one Deridor was foolish enough to revive it. But the whirlwind of upheaval had not yet passed. In 1799, a young General Napoleon Bonaparte arose to become France's supreme leader. For a moment, people believed in glory again. Napoleon promised restored order, an end to civil strife, and the revival of national pride. He succeeded with dizzying speed, crushing the Prussians, occupying Vienna, driving the Habsburgs behind the mountains. France, seemingly exhausted beyond repair, surged with a passion not seen in nearly a century under Bourbon rule. But the price was still blood and gold. This new empire, whether called a republic or ruled by an emperor, still demanded taxes, soldiers, and mythologies to sustain its might. Napoleon never restored Versailles, knowing it had become a symbol of a toxic past. Instead, he chose other palaces, other maps, to weave a new dream of empire. When he fell at Waterloo in 1815, the Bourbon throne was dragged back and placed beneath Louis XVIII, brother of Louis XVI. During the years of restored monarchy, the Bourbons tried to prove they remained the rightful rulers, but no one truly believed in divine authority anymore. Portraits of kings in fur-lined robes held only nostalgic charm. Coronation pomp became stale theater, All of France knew that the eternity Louis XIV had once claimed was merely a dream, an expensive one, paid for with the blood of millions. The people, meanwhile, changed quietly. The middle class grew stronger, armed not with idealism but with pragmatism. They no longer needed a gold-cloaked king to feel content. They needed work, markets, and stability. Throughout the 19th century, Versailles was slowly abandoned, then converted into a museum, a relic of a past no one truly wished to relive. And so, through revolutions, wars, and restorations, France shed the layers of royal attire. In 1871, the Third Republic was born, officially closing the final chapter of a monarchy once thought immortal. Louis XIV's chateau still stood on its ancient grounds, but no one believed it housed divine power. It became a tourist site where visitors gazed at ceiling frescoes and crystal chandeliers, then sighed, realizing all that grandeur was merely a mask doomed to fall. Tonight, if you quietly close your eyes and picture the Hall of Mirrors at dusk, you'll see clearer than ever. The legacy Louis XIV left was not an invincible France, but a nation forced to learn how to rise from ashes, how to question every myth, and how to understand that no throne outlives the human thirst for justice. Perhaps that is his greatest unintended legacy, a reminder that every time power declares itself eternal, it has already begun to rot, and it is the small, once dismissed people who will write the next chapter of history.